Good afternoon. Małgorzata Bonikowska, Center for International Relations, Poland. Welcome to our Tuesday talks. We do it every Tuesday jointly with Konrad Adenauer Foundation office in Poland. Normally we discuss our issues internally, European challenges, the transatlantic relations and the region. But today we would like to focus on something which is more and more important for the Europeans, which is the situation in Southeast Asia. And we decided to do it in an exceptional way because we invited three heads of Konrad Adenauer Foundation offices. Let me start with Warsaw one, David Gregosz. Good morning.
Good morning, Małgorzata. Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you also. And this time we'll not talk about Poland and Germany. We'll talk about Europe and Asia. So thanks for being with us today. And let me welcome our colleagues from the offices in Southeast Asia. Celine, Caro. Celine, hello.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Celine is the head of Konrad Adenauer's Foundation office in Bangkok, Thailand. Thailand, as you know, it's a member of ASEAN, so we will have two ASEAN member states today because Christian Echle is also with us. Christian, hello.
Good morning, Małgorzata. Thank you for having me.
Yes, Christian is talking to us from Singapore, a little country, but very important country in the region and in the ASEAN as well. Let me start by saying that, of course, now all the world looks at the Southeast Asia because of India's problems with pandemic. It suddenly started to be really the topic, very sad occasion. It doesn't need to be really, it didn't need to be this way. So I would like maybe start with David and ask you, David, about the European perspective of what is happening in Southeast Asia generally, India and ASEAN in particular, taking also into consideration that recently we had a German presidency in the second half of 2020, and now we are continuing with Portuguese presidency, but it's both, they are in Troika. So the program of these three presidencies finishing with Slovenia in the second half of this year, it's very much decided together. So what are the priorities and how do the Europeans see the relations with Southeast Asian countries?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Małgorzata. I think in the last couple of months, the Germans tried really hard on the European level to bring Asia as the region more on the agenda. They tried doing this by publishing a so-called Indo-Pacific strategy in September 2020. They led a lot of talks with the European governments in the last couple of months, and they, of course, tried to coin their own presidency between July and December 2020 by setting on the agenda important Asian topics. For example, they tried to finish the so-called Chinese-European investment agreement, and in fact, they reached a compromise. They got a treaty, and now the European Parliament has to ratify this European Chinese investment agreement. It's not that easy, but the example shows that the Germans really tried hard to bring the region into European debates. Of course, this is difficult due to the pandemic situation, and everything is at the moment focused on the challenges regarding Corona. But before this, all of us already felt that the demographic situation, that the dynamism, the innovation center of the world in the 21st century will be Asia, and therefore we have to strengthen our relations towards this region.
But the question is also how to do it, because, you know, what you've mentioned, the agreement with China was also controversial, and it's still controversial in the European Union, widely discussed. But in the same time, also the German presidency started, and the Portuguese presidency took over with the talks with India to maybe counterbalance Chinese.
This is exactly the attempt to counterbalance in the way let's call it the German exposure towards China, or the dependency towards China in a way to intensify the relations to India, to South Korea, to Japan. When you think about the last big free trade agreement, it was made with Japan, the European-Japan trade agreement. So the Europeans really try to intensify their relations in the region. And ASEAN, of course, here comes into play and also plays an important role. Sometimes persons tend to forget that countries like the Philippines or Indonesia or Singapore are also really important for, of course, for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. Therefore, at least I would say the last year in the political scene in Europe, the issue of Asia is on the topic. And it is also due to the fact that China is, of course, trying to build own alliances. When you think about RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Free Trade Area, which China built. So there's a geopolitical battle ongoing in the region, and every country tries to find their position in this geopolitical game.
Right. So, of course, so there's no doubt Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia are generally, more important now than it has been the case 20 or 30 years ago for the Europeans. But I wonder if I can move on to the region, and starting with Celine, I wonder how you see now these relations with European countries or European Union, and if there is anything really discussed widely. Let's start with Thailand, about this European presence in the region and European importance for the region. Please unmute yourself.
Maybe first of all, I would like to underline David's point. I think there is a rising awareness about the fact that the EU needs to engage with Asia on a broad way. So a few countries started to write their strategy for the Indo-Pacific a few years ago. The French started, and then the Germans came up with the strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and then the Netherlands, and now we have a common approach with the EU, who just drafted a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and we are waiting for a communiqué to come in September. So there is some awareness, and I think there are good reasons for that, and David mentioned a few. If you look at the number, and the EU is also explaining with this move with numbers, the Indo-Pacific, this is 60% of the global GDP. This is 90% of the upcoming new middle class. This is 2/3 of global growth, and so on and so on. So of course, the EU needs to engage more intensively with that region. And maybe now to come to Thailand, let's stop in between with the ASEAN. What about the ASEAN? ASEAN, these are 10 countries altogether. I looked it up, 661 million people. So EU and ASEAN, 1 billion people together, if they decide to cooperate. This is a critical mass. It's the ASEAN is the 8th economy in the world, if you take the 10 countries together. And it's also EU's 3rd largest trading partner outside of Europe, behind the US and China. And last but not least, maybe the ASEAN can also be a geostrategic partner for the EU to build up a multipolar Asia, Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is also an important point at the geostrategic level, beyond trade issues. Yeah, and so we are in this process now. The EU and ASEAN started to engage in a conversation to be strategic partners. They are also talking about FTAs, but for now, the discussion is also between the EU and the different ASEAN members. So this is the case also for Thailand. For Thailand, the discussion with the EU is first of all at the trade level, with the idea that would be good to reach a free trade agreement. So the discussion, the negotiation started in 2013. stopped after the coup in 2014, the coup d'etat in Thailand. And now both sides are really engaging since October 2009. There is a willingness to do more together in different areas like security, like illegal fishing, like labor law, like environment issues, of course, and connectivity. That's also a very important word if you look at what the EU and the ASEAN are doing these days. And the first step would be to sign a PCA, a partnership and cooperation agreement. And the second step would be an FTA. So that's what Thailand and the EU are trying to do now. And that's what we hope for the years to come.
Yes, of course, it's good that we also became strategic partners, European Union and ASEAN last year in December. Thailand is one of the biggest members of ASEAN. But let's move to Singapore, which is one of the smallest, but quite important and active. Christian, if you can comment on, how also Singapore, the politicians and the public opinions sees the relations with Europe. And also the question would go towards what is happening in the region, precisely in Hong Kong, and what would be your judgment about the benefits maybe of the situation for Singapore itself.
Yeah, Singapore is indeed the little red dot in Southeast Asia. This is how the Singaporeans describe themselves, also known as a smart nation. So it's very interested in technological advancement. It's, of course, a hub, a trade hub with a big harbor, a big airport. Of course, very much challenged by COVID-19, but it does play a more and more important role for ASEAN. I think this is safe to say. And if we look at the Singaporean perspective on the European Union, I think we really have to look at different dimensions of the partnership. And of course, the most important one is trade. ASEAN, quite similar to the European Union, started out as a group of countries that wanted to integrate their economical their trade, their economical situation stronger. And ASEAN never has reached that level of integration that the European Union is seeing today. So we are still at only 10 countries, and there are still very strong boundaries when it comes to the influence that ASEAN as a regional organization has on domestic and national issues. So there's this culture of non-interference with domestic issues. And from that perspective, trade is the #1 topic, and I think this is also where Singapore, both, and ASEAN are really interested to strengthen the ties with the European Union. We do have free trade agreements with Singapore and with Vietnam from the European side. These processes have been seen as surprisingly slow and slightly painful on the Singaporean side, because it took a lot of just internal discussions within the European Union and rounds of approval in order to have the free trade agreement in place. But at least it's there. So trade is the #1 issue. When it comes to security, sorry.
No, go on.
When it comes to security, Europe is not an established player in Southeast Asia. We look at the major power competition between the US and China, both with very strong presences in the security architecture of the region. And this is where Europe is obviously now, I would say, challenged to show that what we have written down in our strategies, what we are proposing in the strategies that David has mentioned, that we are actually serious about it, and that we want to step up when it comes to our responsibility to build the security architecture in the region.
Thank you for this introduction and the remarks. And of course, we are always thinking about not only one area of cooperation if you want to strengthen the relations. And I would go to David now to ask you, as frank as you can be, what, in your opinion, are really the biggest challenges in the relations with Southeast Asian countries? Because Christian and Céline mentioned trade. That's the most, maybe not easy part, but the most obvious part. But we have several other issues, like Christian mentioned, security. We also have this China's factor, which can unite us, but not necessarily. Depends how these countries see also China and see also the West. We are talking about the region which has long time of colonial presence as well. So I would be very interesting to hear also later on your comments on this perception and historical issues, if they are in the region. And finally, we have completely new challenges like innovative technologies and 21st century revolution. So what would be the challenges in these relations Europeans look with Southeast Asia?
I think, Małgorzata, that the challenge really starts at the European side. I'm sitting here in Warsaw at the heart of Europe, and I'm observing really a complex political situation within the European Union. The EU is still finding it difficult to manage internal European cooperation tasks, and Christian mentioned it. It's really difficult to get a consensus about things just internally. Take the corona management, for example, take the digital vaccination pass, and the European Union is not able to develop a strong foreign policy. And of course, this has to do with different priorities and different expectations toward the European Union. Take Poland, for example, there's a strong focus towards Russia and the US, and Asia does not play that important role, or at least in the last couple of years, this wasn't that important. But nowadays, you see a big investment, for example, of South Korea in Poland. You see the presence of China. You see debates about vaccine from China in Poland. So there is a rising awareness of this. And the challenge really starts in the European Union itself.
So I agree with you that the challenge would be just to have really a common foreign and security policy, because we have it by name, but in reality, not often happens that we are able to take.
Right, and therefore, I wouldn't underestimate the effort to bring the countries in Europe together to formulate at least a core of a strategy regarding a whole region. The problem is that, of course, most of the countries, and I have to say Germany too, is doing, besides these strategic documents, also their own policies in the region regarding trade, regarding foreign policy, and all this. And this, in a way, is also a challenge. I mean, we are not a monolithic bloc in the European Union with one foreign minister which can do all the things, and this is the first challenge. And the second challenge in the relations is, of course, that the region is so heterogeneous. I mean, Singapore is leading basically every technological lists, and there you have other issues to deal with, as for example with the Philippines or Indonesia, and therefore to find a common strategy for a region is really a task, and therefore constant talks and meetings would be the first element. And we have to be very honest. I mean, in the last couple of years, the meetings weren't that frequent. Take the EU-India relations, for example. I mean, we have this so-called strategic partnership with India, but what's behind it from the European side as well? We saw the last summit. The results of it wasn't so clear to me. I mean, where's the beef on the bone regarding these relations? And I mean, relations also means diplomacy, visits, foreign direct investments, and technology, and therefore we have to be better.
Thank you. You are quite skeptical. You sound quite skeptical and pessimistic, maybe. But I'm glad that we discuss more ASEAN countries than, for example, India, because India is a state. It's one single country, even if it's a federal state, while the European Union, it's not. So that's why maybe we are getting, a little bit more time to be able to really elaborate the common position towards for example, China even. But with ASEAN, with 10 members, and the members who are very, very different, as you mentioned, it's a difference of size, of population, of wealth as well, Singapore being one of the most wealthy, and Myanmar, Burma being one of the least wealthy countries. So it's maybe good to compare a little bit how the two sides see each other. I would go to Céline asking, because you didn't tell us much about really the Thai perspective of the European Union and Europe generally. Thailand was lucky to never be colonized, by the way. It's interesting to stress it. But it was squeezed between French from one side and the Brits on the other side for some centuries. I wonder what would be the perception of the European engagement in the region at all, if how also the Thailand sees its own position within ASEAN as a player.
Yeah, sure. If I may first comment on what my colleagues say, I think they just underline we have two weaknesses. The region doesn't see the EU as a security partner first, and in the EU and the ASEAN, we have very diverse countries, so it's hard to find a common ground to cooperate. But I think both sides are more and more aware that it's in their own interest to cooperate together, because as Europe, as the ASEAN members are interested in strengthening their own regional organization for the ASEAN and for the EU, both with the idea that if we have a multipolar Asia in the future, that would be better for everyone. And if the EU is not a strong security partner, as you underlined, Christian, maybe the EU can be a good partner for non-traditional security issues and start with that as a common ground to work together with the ASEAN. So that may be something we can discuss further. The perception of Europe in Thailand, you asked. Well, it depends. It depends which day you ask. I think in the last months, there were some disappointment with the EU related to the COVID policy and the decision of the EU to introduce an export ban on vaccine. And because of that, there were delays in the region and, for example, in Thailand for the delivery of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So that was a very low point, I would say, in the Thai-EU relationship, because the EU didn't manage to deliver the vaccine, the shots quickly enough, and then the Chinese were faster and could present themselves as the big.
And would you agree to the comment that during COVID, and especially after COVID is over, China will really benefit out of this, because as far as the perception of China, it will be better than it was before. Is it true in case of Thailand?
Well, that's interesting. As I said, it depends on which day you ask. At the beginning of the year, China was the good friend, I would say, who helped and gave or exported the Sinovac vaccine to Thailand, whereas the Europeans, forced delays. Now, as you said, there is also the question of the trust, and we see that, for example, in Thailand, the people are a little bit worried of taking the Thai vaccine. They don't know, they would prefer the American one or AstraZeneca, but AstraZeneca hasn't been produced yet. So I don't know what will be the picture at the end of the COVID crisis. I think we need to wait a little bit more. And as I said at the beginning, there was this deception that the EU didn't support Thailand more with exports of vaccine. But now the image is also getting better. If you look at the situation in Europe, and the people here in Thailand see that slowly Europe, as the US, is managing the crisis and will overcome the crisis very, very, very soon. So it depends on which day you ask.
Thank you for this comment. Of course, it's changing, but that's something we are very much aware that for the European Union, the COVID pandemic was not a good start. In the first months, we were not really coordinating our decisions, and that gave us a bad image. But I think the lesson was taken, and we improved a lot as far as internal situation within the European Union, how we handle the crisis. But in the long run, let's see if the Chinese narrative that democracies don't perform well during such difficult time will prevail. We have to really prove that we are good enough to survive and be effective. Christian, in your case, Singapore is more maybe looking at China even than Thailand, because in Singapore there are many Chinese. And also I come back to my question about Hong Kong, because Singapore is a financial center of Asia, not only of Asia, but it connects the West and East, especially it covers China as well. What would be the perception of China and Europe, or like in wider sense, the West in Singapore right now?
It's true, Singapore has the vast majority of Chinese ethnicity. And from a Chinese perspective, that's always cause to say, well, you're basically all Chinese, or at least 80% of the Singaporean population, so you must stand with China. But the Singaporeans beg to differ. They don't necessarily feel themselves as part of China. And in that sense, there's a very interesting survey which is done by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. It's an annual survey which is called the State of Southeast Asia. And it asks exactly about what you've asked. How do you perceive China? How do you perceive the US? How do you perceive the European Union? And in the recent years, of course, this tension between the US and China has been the main topic of the survey. In the last year's survey, people were actually, when they were asked, it's experts actually from the whole region, from all 10 countries, from academia, from policymaking. And when they were asked, if you have to choose, would you rather go with the US or rather go with China? Last year, it was pretty much a 50-50 situation. So it was 49% for China and 51% for the US. After the end of the Trump presidency, the following survey, which was done just at the end of last year, just before Joe Biden took over, that has shifted to 40% China and 60% US. So you can see that at least during last year, the perception of China has not improved in Singapore. It has also to do with the end of the Trump presidency, that's for sure. But I think it also has to do with everything that's related to COVID-19. Now, in the same survey, the experts are also asked about the European Union. And it turns out that with this year's survey, the European Union is suddenly the #1 choice when it comes to other powers ASEAN should cooperate with. So Europe is before Japan, before Australia, before India, the #1 choice of the experts in ASEAN when it comes to international cooperation. And this is very much—
How could you explain this change?
Yes. Just let me tell two more things about this survey. So they also ask, where do you see the European Union's strength and where do you see the weaknesses? And the strength is pretty much the upholding of the multilateral order and the values and the economical power. So everybody who says we should work closer with the European Union emphasizes these three areas. Everybody who's skeptical about the European Union says they are either too concerned with their internal challenges or they are not even willing to step up and to become a major power in the major power concert, so to say. So I think that's a really good picture of how the European Union is perceived. And I think the reason for that is that Singapore has a big interest in balancing out its interests and its relationships with other countries. So it doesn't want to be put in a position where it has to choose between the US and China. So last year actually opened a window of opportunity for the European Union to become more present, to become more involved, because Singapore and other ASEAN countries see the necessity to work, to not only rely on China or not only rely on the US, because this might place them between a hard rock, what's the English, between a hard place and a rock, and they want to avoid that. So they are looking more actively about strengthening the relationship to other regions, to other players, and I think this is also one of the reasons why we saw the upgrade to a strategic partnership between the European Union and ASEAN at the end of last year.
Yeah, so it seems that we are living really in the time of reflecting and redefining our strategies, not only here in the European Union, but also in Southeast Asia. I will just quote some more figures from the Pew Research Institute from Washington from 2019, so before pandemic started, about other countries of the region. For example, in Indonesia, that the image of US and EU is quite similar, and the favorable opinion on this is definitely dominating. But China is very close. So the image of China and the West are not totally, radically different. While there is a big difference in Vietnam, for example. Vietnam is the country which definitely has more issues with relations with China than maybe other countries of the region. I want to ask David also about our European perception of South Asia and Southeast Asia, because the Portuguese presidency started also under the German presidency, was definitely stressing the role of India. And we see that this was maybe not completely new, but it was much more discussed and much more stressed than earlier. Also, of course, because we are realizing that India has a potential, maybe it's the only country who has a potential to counterbalance China directly with 1,400,000,000 people, with quite effective economy, very talented IT people, and new technology industry very well developed. But what about Southeast Asia, and what about ASEAN? We generally say Southeast Asia is important, but we also understand that Southeast Asia is not a country. So we can presume that ASEAN would have very much similar problems that the European Union has, that it is very difficult to discuss it as a region because the countries are so different. So how do you see, are there any top leaders with this group? And if yes, in what, and how we can distinguish between the particular ASEAN member states from the European perspective?
I think we have to distinguish, when it comes to Asia, we have to distinguish different phases. I mean, the last 20 years, we really saw a giant awakening. The economic success of China really covered all the interest from a lot of countries. A lot of countries invested over there. A lot of countries tried to build up good relations with China. But with the takeover of Xi Jinping in Peking, in Beijing, a lot of people in the Western world said, okay, maybe China a little bit develops their internal policy towards a problematic way. And then also Europeans started really to look to other countries in the region, look to the alliance, the so-called Quad, and all the nations you mentioned. And ASEAN is nowadays a region where we can find more countries, where we have maybe policy fields where we have something in common, especially when you think about infrastructure or renewables or the digitization, because here China makes a strong offer towards the ASEAN countries, and not only with the Silk Road Initiative, but also by offering concrete projects and things. And we should be, as Europeans, work on these concrete projects with the countries in the region or with ASEAN as well, and propose concrete policy fields, as I mentioned. I think climate issues, environmental issues, all these digitization issues will play a huge role in the future, and we should come up with these proposals because China is doing so, and this would be important.
So instead of just very important documents, strategic documents, we should really fill in these documents with very concrete lists of projects to compete in a way with the Chinese offer at the table, because Chinese don't speak too much about democracy and values, but they really enter with finances. I just mentioned that on the list of top countries in debt vis-a-vis China are the countries from the region, from Southeast Asia. It's Laos, it's Cambodia, all members of ASEAN. We can just say that the debt reached 1/4 of the GDP of the country. So that's the level where really the dependence starts. So Céline, I come back to the question about Thailand and how Thai politicians also see the role of Thailand within ASEAN in the next future. And what are now the biggest challenges for your country, for the country you work in, vis-a-vis, the corona effect, meaning the crisis, the social economic crisis everybody expects?
Yeah, Thailand is an interesting example when you look at the development of the COVID crisis. The country did very well last year in general. We had a beginning of a crisis like everywhere in February, March 2020, but then the number of cases remained very, very low until the end of the year. And I can say we had a very normal life here in Thailand between August and December 2020. We could travel within the country. The external borders were closed, but within the country, we could travel, we could organize conferences, and the situation was under control. And then 2021 came, we had a first wave in February, and now we are confronted with a third wave since early April, and that one is quite serious. We have many more cases than before. This is the British variant, and it's spreading all over the country, especially here in Bangkok. So we had 25,000 cases altogether until February, and now just a few days ago, we hit the 100,000 cases. So this is the first challenge that the country needs to deal with, and the numbers are growing fast. And the second challenge is that the vaccination campaign hasn't really started yet. There are some delays here in the production of the AstraZeneca shot. The country made the strategic decision to produce its own vaccine here. And as you know, it's difficult to produce a vaccine, so there are delays. And so far, only 3% of the population has been vaccinated. So there are a lot of
makes this time when the pandemic is there, makes it longer. But I wanted to ask about, the business consequences and the economic consequences, because for every European, Thailand is tourism. And there were so many people coming to Thailand for holidays. It must be, a serious hit for the economy of the country.
Yes. The economy contracted by 6% last year, and for this year we are already at a contraction of 2.6%, I think. And as you mentioned, the reason for this contraction is very well connected to the tourism industry. Until 2019, so before COVID came, the tourism will represent roughly 20% of the GDP. The country would welcome 40 million tourists a year, more or less, in the country.
That's the size of a population of Poland.
Yes, with 12 million alone coming from China. And now the expectations for this year are 2 million if everything goes well and if the population can be vaccinated quickly. And the negative prospects are under 1 million because, as I mentioned earlier, for now, the borders are completely closed or closed. If you want to come, you need to go in quarantine for 14 days. So it's very complicated. And with that...
And what are the measures taken by the government? And if there is any role of the other countries of ASEAN, do you have any internal discussion what to implement jointly as a bloc of countries to help?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that ASEAN is very present in the discussion on how to overcome the crisis in general. But of course, you have a few experts saying, for example, we need to work better together for the production and for the distribution of the vaccine. If we want to overcome the crisis, we need to do it together. And the situation won't be good in Thailand, for example, until the border countries, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, and Malaysia are vaccinated. So there is a discussion going on this. but I would say it's more among experts than in the wider public sphere. And for now, the solution is in the short term to come up with domestic policies, national programs. So the government has been very active since the beginning of the COVID crisis in setting up economic relief packages for businesses and for the population so they can come through this crisis. And the last relief package came a few days ago again, but of course it's very expensive. So there are also a lot of people saying we need to do it together. It will be easier. And by the way, we should work together on COVID, but we also have a lot of issues that we could tackle better together. Climate change, of course, situation with the Mekong River, Myanmar, and the situation there now. So there are discussions like that, but I wouldn't say that the majority of the people or the decision makers focus on this level of cooperation for now.
Christian, a similar question would go to you about Singapore, of course, and with special attention also of, how the government, which is well known as a very effective government in Singapore, maybe it's easier to, to take decisions in a smaller state than such a large one like Thailand, not mentioning even Indonesia, 270 million people, the biggest country of ASEAN. But what are the measures taken to fight the consequences of a pandemic, and also how Singapore sees its role within ASEAN in the nearest years?
Singapore is very strict with its rules in order to prevent further spreading of COVID-19. And I think what Céline just described for Thailand is also true in Singapore. The pandemic was brought under fairly good control last year with a very severe so-called circuit breaker in April and May. That was like a complete shutdown of public life. Everyone was asked to stay in their homes, do not receive any visitors. And that was actually quite successful. Also in the second half of last year, things went back to more normal, I would say. But it also helps definitely that Singapore has fairly deep pockets. So there were lots of additional budgets, I think 4 rounds of additional budgets. They were called solidarity budget, rescue budget, and so on, that were given out in order to support businesses and to support the population. Singapore had one blind spot, which hurt it a lot, and that was the situation of the working migrants. And on the outskirts of the city, there's huge dormitories where Bangladeshi construction workers stay in rooms for 8 to 12 people. And there, the pandemic or the virus spread like wildfire. So that was one of the big reasons for the circuit breaker. Within the city, the situation was fairly under control for most of the time. But we've also seen a spike in the last few days. And again, we are very close to a shutdown. World Economic Forum has just been delayed or canceled actually for this year in a decision last night. So Singapore is closing down again, and I think it can again be expected that it will mainly use its deep pockets in order to deal with the financial fallout of this situation. I think both Céline and I have kind of discussed that the integration of ASEAN is not that deep, and this idea of solidarity that I think is very strong within the European Union, with all its pros and cons and challenges that we saw during the unfolding of the COVID-19 pandemic. This idea of solidarity is definitely not that strong within ASEAN. The small, rich countries, Singapore and Brunei, the whole population will have its first round of vaccinations by the end of the year. That's quite clear. And in Philippines, Laos, we look at 2024, 2025 until everybody will receive their vaccine. Not to mention Myanmar, with the situation unfolding after the coup and all the violence there, where there's really no discussion.
Christian, because ASEAN was also or always an economic project. It never was planned as a political project like the European Union, where the idea came up of an ever closer union, and the states are supporting each other. So, and we are in Europe at the moment at the point where some countries are emphasizing their own sovereignty and are saying, take the frugal four, for example, Netherlands, Austria, and Finland, and they are saying, okay, solidarity, okay, but we have to think about our economic strength, about our resources, and we can't do too much regarding the support of other European countries. So there are also limits reached here, I think, and the debate about the European Recovery Fund perfectly showed this in the last couple of weeks.
But in the same time, this European Recovery Fund gives us a very good base for the future development of European project, because it unites us in a very strong way by joint, a bond issued in international financial markets when we have to repay them until 2058, if I remember correctly, the last year. So it gives us really a better perspective for the future, despite
hopefully, Małgorzata, when we use this really to improve our competitiveness and really use this to improve our sovereignty regarding technology, regarding security, and this is really the most critical task, I would say. I mean, to use the money in the right way, not only to promise social policy measures or to help some regions somewhere, but really to identify the most important issues regarding infrastructure, also digital infrastructure, regarding new technologies, take hydrogen, for example, take the renewables, and to really focus on bringing the countries together by defining common projects. And we are talking a lot about the relations between Poland and Germany. I mean, we should seek for common ground, for common projects to bring our relation further. And this could be also an example then for foreign partners, for partners like the ASEAN, to show that it is possible. I mean, the projects we are doing at the moment, I'm thinking about Gaia X, which is a digital project, or thinking about energy policy projects. This is really difficult in a way, and hopefully we are using the money you are intending.
I want also to ask you about one more thing we discuss in the West, which is this initiative Joe Biden launched, that we have to really consolidate among democracies and build our strength for maybe bad times in the future.
But really important point, because the problem for democracies of the West is that some authoritarian states in Asia succeed in generating noticeably outcomes for the citizens. I mean, prosperity, stability, innovation, infrastructure, security. Not only China. The perfect example is Singapore, for example. And the question for the West, for the democracies, is: are we able to deliver the same results, or do democracies wrap themselves in a never-ending story over opinions? Do they disintegrate as polarized societies? These are questions that not only Joe Biden concerns, but also Ursula von der Leyen has in mind with their conference about Europe to talk about these issues.
I wanted to ask Céline and Christian if you can just give us some feedback about the discussion in Southeast Asia, if there is any argument mentioned that democracies just don't work well, because also ASEAN countries, we have different systems within the ASEAN 10, and maybe people comment on effectiveness of the governments, how they handle such crises like now. I'm talking generally about your countries, but I'm talking also about China and US and Europe, the general judgment, if this is about the systems, if there is any comment on which example to follow, or if there is any feeling of a threat, because this is very much also connected with new technologies. I wanted to bring this example because we are knowing very well that we fight pandemic also with use of new technologies, and these countries who used new technologies for fighting pandemic had really good effects. We can mention China from one side, but we can also mention South Korea, which is democracy, but it was using the technology entering very much into the privacy of their citizens. So I would be very interesting to hear if these things are at all discussed and what people feel, how people feel about it. Céline?
Yeah, well, we have our discussions in the EU regarding the effectiveness of the EU integration and the pros and the cons that David mentioned just before. Seeing from abroad, I would say, as Christian mentioned, the EU is associated with good governance, with rule of law, with good education, with protection of the climate, with human rights, and these are all values that are considered positive. And we said before that in the surveys that we see here in the region, the people tend to favor a system like that one compared to other systems. And to give you an anecdote, a few weeks ago, there was a person that started a new Facebook group here in Thailand called Let's Move Abroad. It came out of frustration for the COVID management of the COVID crisis, the political, economic, social situation. So this person created a Facebook group about moving abroad, and within 2 days, he had 500,000 followers and 700,000 something after a week or something like that. So people were discussing, where can I go to work abroad or to study abroad, and which were the countries that were the most interesting for all those people? Well, there were Western countries, the G8 countries, I would say, and the European countries played a very important role in that discussion. So it shows that the model that we promote in Europe with our values is still very, very.
So you want to say that maybe people would respect China for what China was doing or is doing during pandemic, but if they want to immigrate, they definitely don't go to China. They prefer to go to the West, right?
There are facts underlining these, indeed. Thailand or other countries in the ASEAN cannot do without China. They need China at the economic level, and they need to deal with China also for political and geopolitical reasons, for sure. But I think the threat that is very present in Thailand or other countries is that they don't want to be forced to choose. I think Christian underlined this before. So they want to have a multi-dimensional relationship. They want to engage with both. I wouldn't say that European culture is very present on the everyday life beyond gastronomy and fashion, but when it comes to the discussion about the values and where could be my future best if I were to immigrate, then Europe is absolutely on the radar screen here.
Christian, your view?
Also soccer clubs. Everybody has a Premier League club they are supporting here, so that's also very European. But serious, I think the image of democracy has been damaged in the region by two developments. One was the Trump presidency with the situation at the Capitol at the beginning of this year. This was very damaging, and a lot of think tankers, experts talked to me and said this shows that the Western liberal democracy is going to end in the next few years. And the other one is, yes, the COVID-19 management, which has probably also shown some weaknesses in the setup of the European Union. That's the one side, and it's anyway very difficult to speak about all the 10 countries and all their perspectives, but there are definitely voices that say Trump presidency and the COVID management in Europe have been damaging for the idea of democracy. At the same time, I am deeply impressed by what's happening in Myanmar right now. People coming out of military rule for decades and tasting an idea of democracy for just 10 years, now being thrown back under military rule and really fighting without really having a chance against the military and its weapons, going to the streets, protesting, making their voices heard. And this is something that deeply impresses me. And I think that shows that there's a young generation which believes in freedom of expression, that believes in their own like unfolding or using their own potential to achieve what they want in life, and who don't necessarily want states, or in this case corrupt military cliques to tell them what they need to do. Yeah, I see a young generation that still holds some democratic values high. And I see in general a population which is demanding a good life. And if government can deliver that, authoritarian governments like in China, of course, growing middle class, but also in Singapore, people are not so much concerned about a lack of freedom in the media. But as soon as the governments do not manage to deliver, then I think the Western model becomes suddenly much more attractive again. And it remains to be seen how this will develop in the region in the next few years.
The last question I want to ask you all, actually, taking into consideration that you represent one of the strongest think tanks, actually, think tank organizations in the world, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is very much active in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and implementing several projects in the region. I want to follow what David had said, that you know, what is important to do concrete things, concrete projects. So can you describe us how do you see, you know, now the most important areas of your activity as a foundation also, and where do you see the potential of bringing closer, you know, Southeast Asians and Europeans, even on the basis of the project your foundation implements? Maybe we can start with Christian, then Céline, and David will comment on at the end.
I would like to name two programs. One is the Konrad Adenauer School for Young Politicians. This is a format or a project where we identify 20 to 25 young politicians in the region every year, and we bring them together.
So in the region, it's not only for Singapore, right?
No, it's for the whole of Asia, actually. It's not only Southeast Asia, even we also include Indian politicians and politicians from South Korea. And for many of them, it's the first opportunity to really look beyond their own country and to kind of start thinking about how international cooperation is kind of created and brought forward. And to me, that's really a very inspirational project. I thoroughly enjoy the discussions that we have on this platform. There's lots of different opportunities and lots of very different positions. But it shows that there's a culture of debate and a culture of being curious about what's happening in other countries. And from time to time, we also manage to kind of connect that with Europe. So we bring each of the batches, we bring to Germany once a year. As I said, this is just a project that I really enjoy. It, of course, is in the end people to people, but it also, again, engages with the youth. The other one, and David mentioned that quite a few times, I think in the area of innovation and digital progress, we see quite a few role models in the region. We see quite a few interesting developments. And I believe that we have to, again, bring Europe and ASEAN as in a closer discussion about how we want to deal with the control of social media, for example, with the big companies that have so much influence on our daily lives and decision making and opinion making. How do we want to live in our cities? How do we want to organize transport and so on? So I think there's a lot of common ground between ASEAN and Europe in this area. We can learn from each other, and I think there's open doors on both sides, which is also very important. So if I would continue to do very concrete projects, it would be in the area of exchange of young decision makers and in the area of innovation.
Yes, leaders are important everywhere, and to make them more aware and more, how to say, sensitive to the right issues at the right time, it's definitely the key. Céline, from your perspective, Bangkok, Thailand?
Yeah, I think for me, one of my projects for the years to come here in Thailand is to make sure that Europe in general is more visible among the Thai society, among the leaders, the academics, the business people, and the students and citizens in general, because I realized that regularly I feel like the Europeans are doing a lot already. For example, Europe is doing a lot in Southeast Asia, also in Thailand, to help cope with environmental issues, for example. But I realized that the people don't know about that. They don't know. I think the communication is not good between the Europeans and the citizens here or the governments. People are not aware about the added value of cooperating with the Europeans in general. So that's something that I have on my agenda, and I would like to try to help support. So we will, for example, we are now working on creating a new online platform to present news and activities and important public figures coming from Europe to a Thai audience, and maybe we will widen the project then to other countries. So people are more aware of what we are discussing these days. What are experts saying? What are important decisions that have been made at the European level? So we will do that in parallel to traditional conferences and meetings that we have been organizing for many years now. But since COVID, we now know that it's even more easy to talk and to discuss important issues together. I'm sitting in Thailand, you're in Warsaw or in Singapore, and we can meet for 2 hours. I think that's something completely new that is also opening new opportunities for the region when Europeans maybe don't have the time to travel for a one-day conference. And the opposite is true, of course. So I'm really hoping that we will learn from this experience on the positive way.
You touched a very good point that now certain things are much easier and quicker than they used to be. And it's also the fact that our mentality is ready. You know, our mental maps are now very much into this online world. One thing I would like to stress is that, of course, not necessarily Southeast Asians would distinguish between Europe generally and European Union, which is not necessarily very well known. Even us Europeans have problems in describing how the EU works, and not mentioning even the Asians. So it's definitely a lot to do about that. David, your comments at the end of our talk?
I would just say that the colleagues perfectly described the task for Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is basically also a task for many NGOs. The Center for International Relations is doing it too, bringing people together, being platform for discussion, incorporating different perceptions. This is really important because terms like deglobalization, autarky, and polarization are really a threat for all of us, and therefore incorporating different opinions is the task of our time, and bringing them together digitally or in person is the task of Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Of course, it's also part of our German heritage to be an active accelerator of a good cooperation in the world, and therefore we are working in every capital in the world.
So to end this fascinating talk, I just want to add from my side what I find very interesting in the way how ASEAN countries cooperate is the attention on culture and education about each other, because there are 10 member states, very different, as we said, and they want to know more about each other. I think we don't do enough as far as this field is concerned in European Union. We know some countries very well. Everybody studies about France, about maybe even Germany, Italy, but there are some countries we hardly know anything. Not necessarily the smallest like Luxembourg or Malta, but even, South Portugal, the country who now is a presidency, or country like mine, Poland. I think there is a lot to do to improve our knowledge about each other. I think ASEAN countries do it quite well, and they start in primary school to do that. So on this note, let me thank you for this time. Thank you very much, Celine from Bangkok. Thank you. And
thank you for inviting
Christian from Singapore. Thank you as well.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the exchange.
And thank you, David, for this opportunity also to discuss European Asian affairs in this small club. Małgorzata Bonikowska, thank you all who watched, and see you next Tuesday.